By the fall of 1941, German leaders were convinced that the Soviet Union would follow the same fate as Poland and France. Defeat within months following the initial gains of Operation Barbarossa. Confident in their inevitable triumph, some were already beginning to plan a majestic victory parade in Moscow's Red Square, imagining that the city would soon fall under German control. Not only the top brass shared this optimism. Among soldiers at the front, jokes about which company would be the first to parade through Moscow were common. However, the specific details of this supposed parade, such as the number of troops or the format, were never finalized. The only certainty was that Hitler planned to attend in person to supervise the event. The winter of 1941 radically changed this perspective. Soviet resistance stopped the German advance at the gates of Moscow and launched a counteroffensive that forced the invaders to retreat. This defeat marked the failure of the German strategy of blitzkrieg in the east, dispelling any illusions about the parade in Red Square. But Stalin, always attentive to the movements of his enemies, did not forget that German dream. 2.5 years later, with the Red Army advancing unstoppably, he decided to grant them the parade in Moscow, but in a way that no one would have imagined. What is known as the Parade of the Lost, or the Parade of Defeat, was an episode loaded with symbolism. In July 1944, some 57,000 German prisoners paraded through the streets of Moscow, under the curious and sometimes contemptuous gaze of more than 120,000 Soviet citizens. Among the prisoners were common soldiers, officers, and even generals, marching dirty, exhausted, and defeated, guarded by Soviet troops. In a way, you can say that Hitler got his wish for a German parade in Moscow, although not in the way he had planned. Today, dear followers, we will explore this historical event that, although shocking, is little known outside of Russia. Get ready to discover the details behind this symbolic episode, which demonstrates how history can take unexpected turns. In the summer of 1944, the Red Army launched one of the most devastating operations of the war. Operation Barbarossa, a massive offensive into Belarus that devastated the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center. In a matter of weeks, the Germans suffered the loss of nearly 500,000 men, and their military structure on the Eastern Front was shattered. This was the most devastating blow the German army had faced up to that point. As one historian described, Operation Barbarossa tore out the heart of the German army in the East, marking the final turning point. From then on, the Red Army did not stop until it reached Berlin. With this resounding success, Soviet leaders decided to celebrate, but not with a traditional military parade. Instead of showing winning troops, the Kremlin chose to organize a parade featuring the defeated, a decision that surprised even within its own ranks. Although this type of parade was not new, the last one had occurred 3 decades earlier, in 1914, when soldiers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire captured by the Imperial Russian Army paraded through Moscow. But the context of 1944 was very different. The Soviet Union, led by Stalin, decided to recover this tradition and adapt it to its own political message. Thus was born Operation Waltz, named after a famous 1938 American musical film that had been very popular in the Soviet Union. Operation Waltz was planned in strict secrecy by the NKVD. Beyond being a spectacle for the Soviet population, the event had a clear political objective: to demonstrate to the Allies the magnitude of the Soviet success at Bagration, and to raise the spirits of the citizens of Moscow, while sending a message that the German defeat was inevitable. The organization began with the selection of prisoners of war. The majority came from Minsk after the recapture of Belarus, but of the 500,000 captured, not all were in a position to participate. Only those prisoners who were in acceptable physical condition were chosen. undergoing rigorous medical examinations to ensure they could endure the march. Ultimately, 57,600 prisoners were transferred to Moscow to participate in the parade. From July 14, 1944, trains full of German prisoners began to arrive in Moscow. Upon arrival, the captives were distributed in different strategic locations: the Moscow Central Hippodrome, the Moscow Dynamo Stadium, and the field of the Cavalry Regiment of the Dzerzhinsky Division. Local firefighters offered them some water, but conditions were deliberately miserable. One of the prisoners later commented, "It was enough to quench my thirst, but not enough to wash my face." The objective was clear. The prisoners had to be paraded before the Muscovites in the worst possible condition. They were prohibited from washing their uniforms or themselves, and many marched in torn clothes, without shoes, and covered in dust and dirt. Everything was carefully orchestrated to maximize the visual impact of the event. Meanwhile, Moscow residents began to receive information on the radio about a parade planned for July 17th. Most assumed that this was a typical Red Army military parade. But even within the party and army, many were unaware of the actual nature of the procession. Only hours before the event, the prisoners received their last ration, some porridge and bread with lard. With these meager provisions, they prepared to face the most humiliating day of their lives. At 11 a.m. on Monday, July 17, 1944, the March of the Lost began. The prisoners were divided into two large groups. The event was directed by the commander of the Moscow Military District, Colonel General Pavel Artemyev, while Soviet cameramen recorded every moment of the historic spectacle. The parade was carefully designed to convey a message. The 19 captured German generals and 6 colonels led the march, followed by more than 1,000 officers and a large mass of infantry soldiers divided into columns of 600 men. The German senior commanders, curiously, marched with their decorations and uniforms in order, while the common soldiers advanced in the same undone clothes in which they had been captured. The intention was clear: to make a contrast between the defeated commanders and the miserable conditions of their troops. Moscow citizens gathered en masse along the main streets and avenues, such as Gorky Street and Mayakovsky Square, silently awaiting the start of the procession. Some watched with curiosity, others with contempt, and many maintained an air of cold indifference. The tension in the atmosphere was palpable. The first group of prisoners, consisting of 42,000 soldiers, marched from the Leningradskoye Highway through streets and squares until they reached the Kurskaya station. The second group, with 15,600 men, traveled along Moscow's Garden Ring, from Mayakovsky Square to Kanachikovo Station, on the outskirts of the city. The entire parade was guarded by tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers and some 12,000 horse-mounted NKVD officers, armed with rifles and swords. The Moscow crowd watched in absolute silence. Although some cursed, any attempt at physical aggression, such as throwing stones, was immediately stopped by the authorities. Among the prisoners, reactions varied. Some looked with hatred at the Soviet spectators. Others watched them with curiosity. But the majority walked with indifference, resigned to carry out the orders of their escorts. German soldier Bernhard Braun would later recall, "As we walked through Moscow, we were simply obeying orders, as we had done all our military lives. I did not feel humiliated. Worse things are experienced in war." For his part, a young Moscow man named Roman Shenko commented, "There was a dead silence. Nobody said a word, neither them nor us." The Pravda newspaper described the event with a mixture of mockery and contempt. Disgusting green mold spilled from the Moscow Hippodrome into the streets. These men, whom Hitler convinced to be humanity's elite, passed us in rags, dirty, weak, and despondent. Some barefoot, others in boots still resilient, but unable to take them any further because they met us on their way. The parade culminated around 7 p.m., when the last prisoners arrived at the train stations, where they were loaded onto cattle cars bound for prison camps in Siberia. Behind them, a line of cleaning trucks drove through the streets, symbolically washing away the green mold that, according to Pravda, represented the filth of German fascism. The 19 captured generals remained in Moscow by order of the Soviet High Command, as they could be useful for future operations. However, 2 of them, Gottfried von Erdmannsdorf and Adolf Heymann, were later tried and executed for war crimes. Operation Grand Waltz unleashed a wave of international reactions. Some Western leaders criticized the event, calling it humiliating and inhumane, while others interpreted it as a test of Soviet power and a reminder that Germany could be defeated. For the Soviet people, the parade represented an emotional and political triumph, a symbol of justice after years of suffering. The Parade of the Vanquished continues to be remembered as one of the most symbolic events of World War II. Beyond its immediate impact, it remains a testament to how Soviet power transformed a military victory into a propaganda spectacle designed to inspire national pride and send an unmistakable message to the world. The end of the Nazi regime was near.